a comment about.
First, I'm going to introduce the panelists one by one, very briefly. Then I'm going to sort of explain the order, which we should have worked out, but we haven't. But hey, what the hell? And then I'm going to do a sort of lead into the topic, and then sit down and have everybody, as they speak, come up to the podium, present their 10 to 12 minute, 15-minute talk, and then as moderator, I'll be writing down a couple of questions that I'd be interested in hearing. So let's start with Alexander Reid Ross. You want to grab a seat somewhere up here? Sure. Alexander teaches at Portland State University. He's going for a doctorate in geography. He's the author of Against the Fascist Creep, which is a wonderful book. I'll tell a little more about it. That you can buy here when we have a signing after the reading is over. Let's have Eva Cherniavsky up next. Eva Cherniavsky teaches English at the University of Washington. She's an alumni of our first Red May, and she's the author of a brilliant book called Neocitizenship, about the fate of quote-unquote citizenship in a neoliberal age. We'll go next to Shane Burley. Shane Burley is a filmmaker who also writes about fascism. His book, Fascism, What It Is and How to End It, makes a nice companion to Alexander's book, because it isolates fascism thematically. What are the things you'll find in the family resemblance of movements that are fascist or not fascist, and also reviews the history of the resistance to fascism. Excuse me. And last, S. Charusheela, affectionately known to all of us at Red May as Charu, who teaches at interdisciplinary studies in UW Bothell. Charu is here as a kind of a control presentation, because when one talks about fascism, one sometimes ignores the fact that other areas in the world are dealing with fascist movements that may have somewhat different characteristics than the ones that people are trying to isolate to come up with a typology of fascism. So let me just do one more brief sort of introductory note. I find this topic fascinating. Its apparent simplicity, as any of these authors who has researched it knows, quickly disappears. Fascism is used as an epithet meaning bad. After World War II, no one wants to call themselves a fascist. Academic discussions get hung up on taxonomy. What do you mean so-and-so is a fascist? They don't have a political party that they're head of in a mass movement, so blah, blah, blah. Placing their taxonomy on interwar fascisms between, in France, Italy, and Germany generally, sometimes Spain. We've also had an amazing moment, which I didn't realize totally. I mean, obviously you can see, right-wing, racist, militarist activity that's gone on since the Order and the Patriot movement and so forth. But there's a line in Alex's book that talks about a Russian fascist, Alexander Dugin, being concerned to provide an intellectual genealogy of the right. So in other words, there were all these European thinkers, Alain de Benoit, Alexandre Dugin, Guillaume Fay, and that essentially tried to make fascism highfalutin again by pulling in Spengler, Heidegger, and all sorts of other people. And I found this out to my surprise. I mean, I knew about 4chan and blah, 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 and Mencius Moldbug, and, the kind of online alt-right and so forth, that one night on a site which gives free text to graduate students who can't afford the outrageous prices. They're all bookstores, but this charge. And I encourage everybody to buy here, by the way. They posted on a dump all of these texts that I had never heard of, but when I opened them, I thought, wow, Francis Parker Yockey, Imperium. The guy talked himself into being a prosecutor at Nuremberg, and yet here is this weird mix of Spengler, race, nationalism, and so forth. So, and one goes on. All of these things are, I believe, and I'll defer to Shane on this. I'm sorry, to Alex and Shane, have worked their way into what was a very stupid form of fascism in the United States that essentially didn't go much beyond certain notions of Christianity and whiteness. Now, I do want to say again that the idea with fascism is not to look for a taxonomic definition. But Alex has come up with a wonderful way to think about it, which grows out of historical study, which is that if you take a place like France, which a couple of scholars have studied in detail, you find that there are all these sometimes called proto-fascist movements that could be called radical right, proto-fascist, fascism in the 30s. Leftists even, renegade leftists would drift out into one, go in the other, move on to another, and where they ended up didn't really tell you the extraordinary trajectory that they had followed, and it's the ecosystem itself that is fascinating. And if you want a wonderful portrait of the ecosystem, if any of you are Roberto Bolaño fans, there's a book called Nazi Literature in the Americas, which presents imaginative biographies of fascists from all over the world as they move through one movement or the other, in the way that Borges' Universal History of Infamy comes up with fictions. But one gets a wonderful sense. I never even knew, for example, that in Spain there was something called the Blue Division, where people volunteered to go fight in Stalingrad for the Nazis. Anyway, guiding us through this thicket. Now I want to say one last thing to the idea of succession as the topic here. I've noticed that three things are happening that are often studied not in proximity to one another. One is that there are various forms of fascisms that are proposing some sort of secession around identity and white identity and so forth, communes, preparedness and whatever. There's also, as we know, on the left, there's many groups on the left that look beyond capitalism to look to the idea of withdrawal, creating something. But what's happening in the macrocosm, as Eva Cherniavsky points out so beautifully in the book, is that the government itself is withdrawing from being a government. They're putting everything on you and saying, good luck, hope you don't die. That's essentially what neoliberalism is. So when you put together these three centrifugal forces, what do you get? That's where we want to go in this discussion. Would you like to go first, Alex?
Why not?
Great. Bye.
All right. See if I can fit my computer. They make these smaller and smaller, so you can't fit this. Right? Cool. All right. Podiums. What are you going to do? Hey, everybody. How's it going? All right. Awesome. I thought this was going to be like a panel thing as opposed to like stand up and give your spiel type thing. But, I teach, so this is normal for me. Thank you very much to the organizers and the bookstore for having us here and inviting us out. It's very good to be here in Seattle. I always love coming to Seattle, and thank y'all for being here, of course, as well. First, the first kind of question that some of us asked ourselves when we were thinking about this panel is this indeed an age of secession, right? Because that presumes a lot, A lot of people don't necessarily want to secede. It's still kind of a marginal movement, perhaps, except for when you think about things like Brexit, and how secession is framed and what it's framed to do, right? Obviously, we have progressive factions of Brexit people who are saying this will be good for immigrants and this will be good for the national economy, and we're doing this, the right of free travel is actually a bad thing, and so there's a progressive argument for this, just like there's an extreme reactionary anti-immigration argument for it. And so we have to tease out the two sometimes and understand the actual movement itself, the separatist movement in itself, as multifaceted and extremely complex, right? These kinds of politics bring with them true believers just like cynics, right? Everybody has their own reason for joining a movement, and these movements can be directed toward extremely reactionary politics, obviously, but they might not appear like that at first. And that's one of the really fascinating aspects. A lot of controversy was kicked up about this this event. There was a conference that was sort of chaired by a far-right party called Rodina in Russia. The conference itself was actually called The Right of Peoples to Self-Determination and the Multipolar World. So if anybody's familiar, has anybody read like a significant amount of Vladimir Lenin? Here in Red May. So the right of peoples to self-determination is one of the pillars of Leninism. Absolutely one of the most. That's what he got in the biggest fight with Rosa Luxemburg about. The right of peoples to self-determination, the idea of building nations, communist nations of basically ethno-states, and the fact that people for him, people should be able to elect to do that and, effectively secede, although they shouldn't be, encouraged to do that kind of thing. And so this idea was picked up by extreme nationalists who also came out of the Soviet Union and are basically imbued with a lot of Soviet ideology, even though they rebelled against it significantly in the 70s and 80s. You also have to understand on top of that, right, that in the 70s and 80s, the Soviet ideology had become significantly ossified and reactionary. So there's this tendency called National Bolshevism, which was really developed in the 1920s and 30s in communication with both the left and the far right, in order to try to fuse elements of revolutionary or the conservative revolution and left-wing revolution in order to bring together the Soviet Union and prospective new Germany in one sort of confederated ultra-nationalist left-wing movement. And this is obvious fascism, but it's a certain type of fascism that until recently was really kind of marginal. However, with the financial crisis of 2007-2008, there's an increase of class analysis among just about everybody, an increase of sense that the centralized governance, the centralized economies have completely failed. Neoliberalism has been utterly discredited. We need to build something else. And so nationalists accept this change in people's understanding, mentality, and co-opt that sort of class analysis. Although, if you look back at the fascist movement, there have been workerist aspects of it with the skinheads and that kind of thing. However, the thing is, if you have a Nazi skinhead walking up and talking about the working class, you're not going to be really convinced. You're going to be like, oh my god, this is a Nazi skinhead screaming at me, right? And so what they have been doing is trying to intervene in cultural, intellectual spaces and to disseminate their ideology using left-wing kind of talking points and even the rhetoric of liberalism, right? So for the fascists, diversity is not people of all cultures and ethnicities living together in peace and communication and openness. It's actually everybody separating out into ethno-states because your essential culture and heritage is what's the most important about you yourself, right? And so that's for them the right to diversity. It's a complete inversion while maintaining the shell of the liberal discourse, right? So this is how fascism operates, how it insinuates itself, and so they can take the right of peoples to self-determination and transform that into what they call the multipolar world, right? So for those uninitiated into the Eurasianist ideology, consider yourself lucky. But for the purposes of this talk, the idea of the multipolar world sort of started in its nations with the collapse of the Soviet Union, where there's a new kind of discourse that this is the end of history, Soviet Union is gone, the kind of bipolar relationship between the West and the East has collapsed, and maybe now there's going to be a spreading out, a horizontalization, the world is flat or whatever. And so you get the multipolar world, which after Putin gets into power turns through Alexander Dugin, who's a fascist ideologue, into this idea of separate authoritarian states that are all connected in an empire centered in the Kremlin, which is really the third Rome, right? And so Eurasianism, with Putin's help, became almost the sort of implicit state ideology of the Kremlin. And you have, it is the explicit state ideology of Kazakhstan. It is extremely influential, not only for the army and the chief of staff of the army, but also for the cultural sector in Russia and the political sector. So you have a real issue with the rise of fascism in Russia that is rooted in the sense that the left and the right should destroy liberalism by formulating authoritarian blocs that are in communication with one another and effectively developing the same kind of movement. And they use separatism for those ends. And they kind of always have. Have you all heard of South Ossetia, for example? I don't want to say they always have. For the last 10 years. South Ossetia was part of Georgia and then split off in a fairly violent conflict that took place in 2008. And this was sort of the beginning of serious crisis between the Russian Federation and the West. Georgia is seen as a more Western-friendly country with the president Saakashvili there, and South Ossetia is seen as this expansionism that had struck after the Orange Revolution in 2004 in Ukraine. So there's like a response, a kind of reaction that Russia had toward the insinuation of liberal ideologies in formerly Soviet bloc states and Soviet-friendly states. And so Russia's response through foreign policy has been expansion in places like South Ossetia, and expanding by sort of chiseling away, key aspects of Western power and bringing them under the hegemony of Moscow. And you see this also with Ukraine in a very interesting development. Not just interesting because we've all been watching it happen, but also interesting because the first episode of significant sort of Kremlin-related cyber attacks really came out in 2008 with the South Ossetia conflict and came to a real head with Ukraine, right? 2013, 2014. And so we saw these kinds of tactics coming about, and then in 2014, when the Crimea referendum happened, there's another little separatist thing. You have Putin meeting with the Front National instead of meeting with the actual government of France, and developing ties to the separate radical right regime. Not regimes, but parties throughout Europe. And in this 2015 conference, right, of peoples to self-determination in the multipolar world, they're actually bringing together separatists, like the Republic of Texas, like the Republika Srpska, which is a pretty significant part of the genocide, the Balkans genocide in the 90s, and representatives of the U.S. left connected to the World Workers' Party. And so you have this meeting, right? Authoritarian left, authoritarian right, separatists, trying to use those different elements in a geopolitical match, right, if you will, which is nothing really new. I know I don't have a whole lot of time left, but what's fascinating about this is if you look at Karl Haushofer, who was arguably the key geopolitics guru of the Nazi Party. He was there with Rudolf Hess. He was Rudolf Hess's teacher, and he was there in the jail with Hitler and Hess while they dictated the Mein Kampf so that he could make sure that they got the geopolitics part right. One of their interests is Lebensraum, right? And another interest is Japan, because Haushofer actually did his dissertation on Japan. And he studied Japanese imperialism, because the Japanese imperialists put themselves forward as the leaders of an anti-imperialist movement, an extremely imperialist leader of the anti-imperialist movement, but a leader nonetheless, which had sort of fascist, proto-fascist ambitions towards Manchuria, and was bringing over Muslims from Central Asia, and actually against Russia, ironically, and against China. And Japanese interests also projected out into the Pacific, and aligned with anti-white nationalism, fascinatingly enough. So they could be genocidal on one hand, but also anti-white supremacist on the other hand. And they had a group called the Black Dragon Society, which gave funds to black nationalists in the United States. So there's already, in the 1920s, 1930s, this connection between fascists and sort of left-wing separatists globally. And this is used explicitly as a strategy to destroy liberalism, which is a bad strategy for the left, it turns out. What else? So, I think, how am I doing on time? Do I still have time?
Yes, take 2 minutes.
2 minutes. All right. Yeah, so we've seen these kinds of things representing themselves as well during the election, 2016 election. Interestingly, if y'all have heard of it, the Internet Research Agency, which was the troll factory that was being run by Prigozhin, who is also running a pretty Nazi militia, or not mercenary unit that's been fighting in Ukraine on behalf of the separatists and fighting in Syria. So he was running the Internet Research Agency, Prigozhin, and the Internet Research Agency, there have been groups like USA Today went through every single one of their ads, and it turns out that they've been amplifying white nationalism, but also amplifying anti-racism, both in the most militant way possible, but in order to stimulate conflict within the United States and basically cause liberalism to collapse. One of the groups, interestingly enough, that they helped amplify was one of the Texas separatist groups that went over in 2015 to the right of peoples to self-determination in the multipolar world. So this group was supposed to join in a protest that was actually called for by the Internet Research Agency. And the counter demonstration against that was also called for by the Internet Research Agency, and both sides were called there to be armed, right? So this could have been a Civil War sparking incident that was completely manufactured, right? And when we think about these kinds of things, what a lot of people in the third positionist aspect, the National Bolshevik side of the fascist movement like to say is, well, if you look at the old times in the left, like Marx was an anti-Semite, Proudhon was an anti-Semite and a woman hater, and Bakunin was an anti-Semite. So, like, really, we represent the old school left. And it's like, well, what do you say to that, right? Like, we've changed a lot, so the important thing is to remember that, like, social change is not necessarily tethered to left and right oppositions, and that left and right oppositions, when they're ossified in that authoritarian way, can lead to international catastrophe, and that we are society, and we should all maintain ethical and principled stance against racism and inequality. So, thank you very much.
Could you go now, Shane?
Sasha already talked about everything I was going to say. So this will just be really short.
Shame on you, Shane.
So we spent some time thinking about this idea of secession and what kind of value a term like that has today. And I think... Oh, am I totally unhearable?
Just be in the mic.
How about now? Okay. I can hear myself now, so I must be good. One of the things is that secession and revolution are kind of they're tied together in ways that go back a couple hundred years in the U.S. In a lot of ways, they're also in conflict with one another. And so I think that's something that as we see a kind of change in the far right, but also a change in the left, we start to think through what revolution is going to mean in a 21st century context. So secession can really be seen as kind of a removal of something from something else. So is it a new society that emerges from an old and decides to cut itself off, or is it a person? Is it a family? Is it a small group of people? But whatever it is, it's a removal, but not the obliteration of the old thing. It basically is saying we're creating something new, and we're walking away, and we deserve the right to do that. The largest example is the Confederacy. And this was really built on this idea that there was a natural right to walk away, to say that this was ours, we voluntarily entered into some kind of agreement, they didn't, and that they have the right to walk away, they don't. But that's really kind of inherent to that logic. There's a kind of history of religious secession, right? The idea that we create this communal group, we're going to do it our way, we're going to kind of live and let live, and we're going to be separate. We're not going to actually challenge the legitimacy of the larger system in any real systemic way, but we are going to exist on our own, and we have the right to do that. I think in a lot of ways those are right-wing secessions, no matter how you kind of deconstruct them. There's debate about things like Quakers, I think, that are fair, but I think for this purpose, in a lot of ways, this secession is the right to inequality, it's the right to bigotry, it's the right to formal social orders that are even more extreme than the ones that are already baked into our society. In the 60s and 70s, not this happened, obviously in decades before, but I think it's prominent in people's minds in the 60s and 70s of things like the commune movement, or even like the different self-help movements that separated from society. They wanted communities of their own, wanted to do things their own, but they're really not in contest with society. They really accept the basic premise of society. They just don't want to be a part of it. They're not going to take up arms. They're not going to go challenge society in any meaningful way, but they will walk away from it. And I think in that same vein, in the years that came afterwards, secession in that way maybe was largely discredited on the left, but not in the individual way. So even now we see movements that really are largely secessionist in a way. Being vegan is secessionist in a way. It's not necessarily saying that you're going to take down a larger system of meat consumption with your individual choices, but you don't want to be a part of it. So you're going to do something separate. Polyamory, in a way. There's other kinds of states. And now, this isn't to criticize any one of those things. And in reality, these were called, when I was younger, kind of survival pending revolution. These might be better ways to live. They're better for me personally. They actually fit people better. But in a way, they're not in direct contrast to society. They're not going to smash the infrastructure that's being challenged there. This runs a really different course than the open revolution. And in a lot of ways, open revolution is the direct inverse of that. It's saying, I won't actually walk away from society. I'm taking society, and it's going to be mine. I think I was trying to think of what's the dual to this, and it's actually, I think, the concept of dual power, where there's an acknowledgement that both societies can't exist simultaneously. So on the one hand, we can have a commune or something that plays by its own rules. Maybe it tries to abolish private property, other oppressive institutions. But the reality is, it gets to a certain size, it's in direct contest with the state. It can't exist on its own. The state will crush it. Economic pressures are put onto it. The entire society still exists outside, so all the rules are still there. All the things, implicit bias, all the things that people have been baked in, they bring it into that because they haven't actually done away with that larger society, the larger systems that have led there. And on the left, at the very least, I think that trend towards the direct kind of obliteration of an old society and rebuilding something new, one that has to exist with the other institution gone, has largely been the dominant form of this. Secession, on the other hand, has largely been a more right-wing function, at least in the U.S. There's a lot more kind of history, and I think that comes directly out of things like the Confederacy and other types of movement, but when we think of secession, we largely think about it in the right-wing context, at least in the U.S. So I guess for this purpose and for my book and that kind of background, secession in, I guess, the world of Donald Trump and the world of the alt-right, I think, at least in my mind, that brings up white nationalism immediately. And that project is really the project of the white ethno-state. And it's a state for white people. And there's two versions of this. Again, there's the one where it kind of breaks apart and it's separate from the rest of society. So white nationalists can, play by their own rules, and they're not going to interact with the larger communities around them. But this is kind of their space. And then there's the other one of saying, well, no, actually, we're going to completely challenge all multicultural systems, take them down and take them over, and have like a great white empire. That kind of more revolutionary system for white nationalism in the 20th century really dominated a lot more than the secessionist one. There really was an idea, and I think probably from good experience, that they probably could take that back. There was systemic white oppression. There's, especially throughout the South, there's a lot of like kind of infrastructure to build on, and so there probably was a palpable sense inside things like the Second Era Ku Klux Klan that they actually could overthrow the emerging of multicultural society and take it back entirely. And as like the left, as social movements basically took that down, went after Jim Crow, and built a lot of movements, labor movement, that became much more of a pipe dream, and actually secession began to emerge as a concept, as a sort of answer. Like, okay, if we're not going to be able to actually obliterate the United States and all of the new social mores, maybe we can withdraw from it and make something new. A lot of this, in the modern context, and when they say ethno-state, what they mean is partitioning. So it means a sort of breakup of the U.S., whether it's initiated by them or they're just taking advantage of it. And through that, to create kind of white enclaves that are autonomous states in some way, and to try and offer up that same model to people of other minority groups or identities. And that way they can kind of preserve their image of what a white society should be. I think, we're in Washington. I'm from Oregon, which was founded as a white utopia, essentially as a white settler state. And there's that history of settler colonialism made the Northwest so kind of attractive to white supremacists that wanted to start the secessionist project. So the Northwest imperative was to this idea of let's bring all these white activists, quote unquote, up to the Northwest. They would get jobs, they'd build communities, and they would start to shift the mores there, so the idea of secession for this area could be more palatable. And I think that it was largely focused in the 70s through the 90s in places like Idaho, which much more rural, land was cheap. For a while, you could still get jobs that were kind of sustainable for a family. And you saw projects like the Aryan Nations pop up that really started to take over northern Idaho. But this area wasn't immune to it either. And so I think living here, we've actually seen the continuation of an old system where really moving out west and moving up into the Northwest was a way of escaping what they didn't want, which is a multicultural society, and trying to move towards that concept of secession. Part of that was also trying to, as Sasha talked a bit about, was to create this sense that white secession was about self-determination. But it wasn't just about white self-determination. This was just a larger move towards self-determination. So there was attempts to work with black nationalist organizations or even Chicano nationalist organizations in the Southwest and say, like, oh, we have a common objective here. We all want the right to secede. We all want to partition off the U.S. and create something for ourselves. And I think in the last few years, a common pattern has emerged, and this has happened in other times, is when that movement gets strong enough, the white supremacist movement, whether the alt-right or the neo-Nazi movement of the early 90s, whenever it gets strong enough, it begins to abandon secession as a real concept. In a lot of ways, secession over the 20th century became a compromise. They're not going to have grand revolution, so they'll take secession instead. But the kind of point is that when they get large enough and when they get visible enough, secession is no longer good enough. Instead, absolute open obliteration of non-whites and the takeover of continents is absolutely on the table. And so I think since 2014, there was a dramatic shift in a lot of the language that was used. And the language that's used today has returned to old school imperialism and a real grasping at what a great white empire could be versus an enclave and the secession from the rest of society. They're no longer willing to accept something like a Northwest territory. They want the entire place. And in a lot of ways, they use the concept of secession as a sort of idealism. We can think of a white ethno-state, I can imagine it, and in kind of the German idealist sense, it can really drive our vision. So even if it's not as kind of cleanly explained as something like, oh, we're going to take over Northwest U.S., at least they can think about it and kind of imagine it. And instead what happens is that white identity they're trying to build is that ethno-state. And it fuels their community, and it drives bonds between them, which ultimately they want to become revolutionary. Sorry, I think using your iPad for notes is terrible.
Wrap it up, I think.
Gotcha. So I think the one last thing I guess I would say is that when the concept of secession or even kind of a white revolution seems really far off, the reality is that in times of turmoil, there's collapse kind of in the air. Anything can happen, and we don't own those revolutionary periods. There's a lot of forces at stake, and so I think that's something to stay conscious of and not kind of dissuade it or forget it as something that's irrelevant. So.
I had not expected to go, so I hadn't quite. No, that's fine. I got it. Let me see. Yeah, I think I will. Let me just pull this up. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm going to see if I can read my notes while also speaking into the mic. So there we are. So my aim is to change or give a larger frame to the discussions of fascism that are taking place right now. And I'm actually going to try and pull together a couple of themes that came up earlier around the theme of secession and inclusion. And I'm going to do this by way of India. Right? So to start with, I actually wanted to, as it turns out, I'm really glad you mentioned Oregon, I wanted to start with an example of a secessionist movement led by Indians that took place on this country's soil and which is now a Netflix, highly successful, wild country. And I want to start with that for two reasons. One is that it is very important that I just need to say that that was not the first bioterror incident on soil in this part of the world, unless you forget the smallpox. So, and this is secondly worth remembering because Jody Bird pointed out to me that if you look at Wild Country and the interviews with Philip Tolkis or Swami Premnarayan, he's the guy who is the Rajneesh lawyer at the very end who's still very successful. All of those interviews, there's this bizarre, weird, Native American-ish feathers thingy piece of art behind him the entire time. And this, I think, is really worth pulling out, this sort of odd mishmash of Native American art and Indian ethnicity, because I want to point out a very particular construction of identity that's at play here in this secessionism, which links back to the specific guru who is so important to these people, who was actually Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh or Osho. Osho is interesting because, and this is what's fascinating, is how much of this kind of Bhagwan stuff was presented as if it was self-evident what it meant to have a Bhagwan. And there was a sort of vaguely leftish, New Ageist tinge to the Netflix presentation, because it was always those people are conservative and we are, right? The guy who led them, and the reason he was so popular is that he was an anti-communist, anti-Gandhian member of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which has its origins in an admiration of Hitler. All right? So this guy left the RSS because he was too radical in his politics for them. And he particularly, the piece of the RSS he didn't like. He liked everything else. The will to power, the anti-communism, but he felt there's no point being an anti-communist if you don't get to enjoy consumerism. And so it really was the excess consumption, which is part and parcel of what he promised people, which is what made him so attractive. And that's actually why he played so much better with Westerners than he did with Indians. Because, he promised you essentially a form of identity that spoke to both imagining yourself as superior to everyone else, as the chosen ones who had a right to this land alongside an absolute rapacious form of consumption of resources, of labor, right? This is why that Rajneesh ashram was all whites. They didn't actually have any lower caste people. They didn't actually have any uneducated Indians, right? The only Indians they had were very elite. So this tells you something about the RSS that gets transplanted here. And I want to talk about this idea of a secession from society with another moment when whites were in this part of the country, which was the Bellingham race riots, where in Bellingham in 1907, you had an almost overnight eradication of all Indians who were mostly Sikhs at that time through a race riot that just told people to get out of town. So if we think of Indians as emerging here only after Microsoft, it's because prior to this, the Indians over here were thrown out in a very violent race riot as working class Indians. So that way in which there were two types of Indians, one is this RSS Indian engaging with the West, but also this other kind of Indian, the Sikhs, who eventually became part of the Gadhar party, which was an anti-colonial party which ended up mainly operating around California because they got sent south from here after Bellingham, and who were actually very supportive of the anti-British movement and saw themselves as a working class, radical, anti-colonial party. So these two, I think, I want to come back to them because I want to note that what they do is they help us understand that a lot of what I'm going to talk about and what's happening in India right now, from the beginning, has always been about a transnational circulation of ideas and people. So the things that I'm talking about are not like India didn't have any exposure to anything and then suddenly out of the blue something is happening. Right? So for the people who are unaware, right now in India we have in power the Bharatiya Janata Party. The BJP is the political wing of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS, which is the military arm of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, which means the World Hindu Council, and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad is the umbrella organization that includes a cultural wing, a political wing, and a military wing. In the past, many of the people who won election were members of the political wing, but more recently, including with yesterday's re-election of Yadurappa in the state of Karnataka, we have people who are open members of the military wing, who have been trained in the military wing of the RSS, now holding political power, including our current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. So this group not only operates in India, it also operates in the United States. Some of the biggest struggles we have fought have to do with textbooks in the United States, where under the name of multiculturalism, well-meaning liberal to left-wing activists and scholars have supported a rewriting of textbooks to eliminate all mention of caste, of racism, of gender inequality in Hinduism on the grounds that it is rude to our minority colleagues. This peculiar way in which liberal sentiments are mobilized in order to justify a cultural sphere which is pure is something that you had already alluded to when you talked about the odd relationships between secessionist fascism and right-wingers. I want to talk about the space in which the fascists have not been forced to have these kind of quasi-secessionist tactics, but have succeeded in actually getting the whole pie, which is India, where they're not like in small pockets anymore. They have succeeded. They are the government, right? In a much more substantive way than in the US. So the center of the BJP vision is the idea of Ram Rajya, which was articulated by Goldwalker in We and Our Nationhood Defined. In Goldwalker in We and Our Nationhood Defined essentially says, Hitler was right that to define a nation, if we want to become a new nation, you need a peoples with a connection to soil. What he got wrong was who the chosen people were, was us, and what he got wrong was who the right enemy is, which is Islam, right? So part of the fight with the BJP breaks down into an ongoing fight then around Islam, which is behind the partition of India. Eventually, the Hindu-Muslim communal rights, the Hindu side of it was not secular, even though we like to think it was. The Hindu side of it was the BJP. If the Muslim side was Jinnah in Pakistan, right? So what you see in that identification of Hinduism was an ongoing elite fascism. And I want to highlight this because there is currently, in relation to the rise of Trump, a narrative in place where fascism is about a group of whites who are under tremendous economic pressure, who because of class anxieties, because of globalization, because of the loss of capital, and because tension that comes from this sort of flight of capital makes people vote for Trump. So you hear repeatedly this argument that what we need to do is to know why they voted for Trump. What we need to do is to understand the tensions that make them vote there. And I want to tell you that that might be a mistake if you look at India, because the people who are brought in this party are not people who are at a moment when fascism, when economy is poor. Fascism here is rising not at the moment when capital is leaving. Fascism here is ascendant at the moment when capital is arriving. Capital here is not ascendant at the moment when jobs are scarce. Capital here is ascendant at a moment when you have the biggest boom in the history of this country, right? So I think that an older kind of narrative of what fascism is and does tries to relate this, inside Marxism, tries to relate the rise of this identity to a sense of working class fragility. I want to argue instead that if you look at the post-World War II period in particular, you saw a rise of nation states that were supposed to have a certain type of role. The role of being the people, the nation state had to have a certain type of role after World War II in relation to its own citizens and the role that it played in representing its citizens in the global arena. So as an individual in the world, one of the first articles of the United Nations is the right to be a member of a nation state, the right to citizenship. This is enshrined not just in national constitutions, but in the United Nations Charter, because the assumption is that your rights will be represented for you by your nation state. There's no space inside the United Nations to directly go to the United Nations, right? You have to go through your nation state. To be stateless is to not have a seat at the transnational table. This is one of the questions that's surrounding Palestine. It is also one of the questions surrounding an even older occupation, which is Kashmir. So in 1947, a few months before 1948 and the establishment of Palestine, in 1947, when India and Pakistan were created, there was a fight around what was called the Ascension of Princely States. In the Ascension of Princely States, a variety of states that were not directly under British control but were inside the territory and the princes had certain kinds of relationships with the British, now had to be brought in to the fold of India. Not everybody wished to, but many were forcibly brought in to be part of undivided India, of the whole state of India. Kashmir was one of them. It's a border state, and there remains a sort of question about whether Kashmir should have been in India and people's decisions to be in Pakistan, which is a Muslim state instead. There's also a subgroup that nobody talks about who did not want either India or Pakistan, who really wanted and who still ask for something called Azad Kashmir, the independent state of Kashmir. Right? So secessionist movement. Prior to that, almost immediately after 1947, Nehru gave his Tryst with Destiny speech. 1948, the army was called out for the first time to suppress the peasant revolt that took place around the state of Telangana in terms of the ascension of the princely state of Hyderabad into the Indian constitution. 1952 was our first election. 1953 was the first secessionist movement in the northeast of India around the state of Nagaland. 1958 was the first officialization of what was by then a routine military operation in what had become a legal term called disturbed area. If you are legally considered a disturbed area, you have the Armed Forces Special Powers Act come into place, which is the act that was first put for secessionist movements around the Nagaland area and then extended to Kashmir. So what I want you to see in this is that something that we know about ideas of secession and identity changed after World War II when you came up with decolonization, taking nation-state separatism as the solution for human rights issues, right? That is, there is no, when I had this discussion about the problem of nation-states and being global with John Osorio in Hawaii, he told me, Charu, you have your state. Let me get my government, then I will critique the nation-state. So the problem is that only thing worse than having a crap nation-state is not having a nation-state. Right? It's kind of like Joan Robinson said, the only thing worse than being exploited under capitalism is not being exploited when you're under capitalism, which means you're jobless. Right? So it's that tension that we do not at the moment have a good way to imagine an international architecture for political constitution of rights, which makes the nation state have this very peculiar relationship to the issue of secession. Because the issue of secession is not that secession is good or bad, because that naturalizes. So when you say, well, they want to secede from America, it's an interesting question. It might be something that's receded into the past here, but in India, if someone says, I want to secede from India, it is like, well, that was created fairly recently, and it was created under pressure, and from the beginning, nobody accepted the terms of inclusion. So the counterpart of the question of succession is the question of the terms of inclusion, which goes back through all these states. And the issue, I'm out of time, yeah. And the issue then of how you imagine not the state, but the nation state in relation to the question of politics. Because I think that we assume state is governance and nation state is governance, but nation state is a very specific way in which you authorize governance. And so I would like to suggest that we have to understand fascism in a global context, instead of trying to assume false consciousness or assume that it is primarily about people who are vulnerable or under power, voting for the wrong guy. We may want to actually follow Marx's edict that we do a materialist analysis of the way in which this institution operates around the nation state. And the way in which it operates is that it draws on the idea that if you can consolidate a certain identity, that identity will materialize in the institution of the nation state. So it's not just a cultural phenomenon, it's got a material institutional presence, and that is the material stake of identity today, which helps us understand fascism. Thank you.
Okay, is that good? Can everybody hear me? Great. Well, there's so much to talk about. I actually kind of want to skip my talk and just go directly to discussing. There's a lot to say about this, but I will talk briefly, and I'm going to take us back to the U.S., because that's what I work on, but I'm not going to talk about fascism. I actually want to talk a little bit about left secession in the U.S. today as a response to neoliberalization. And this does fit a bit with the argument of my book, which Philip cited at the beginning, in which I try to think about what we now routinely cite as neoliberalism, the neoliberal state, in terms of how state power operates. And one of the things I argued in that book is that it seems to me that state power in the U.S. no longer operates hegemonically. And I think this actually goes to the nation-state question that Charu was talking a little bit about. So let me just unpack that a bit, right? We think about hegemonic power, sort of following Gramsci, right? We assume that in order for a particular set of interests to capture the state, they have to first of all, kind of forge alliances, right, with other kinds of sectors. They have to gain control of certain kinds of institutions within the state, right? So they have to build what Gramsci calls a ruling bloc. But then the other kind of key piece of this is that they have to then, having forged this particular sort of elite alliance, they have to work in a way to make this feel to people like a broader general interest, right? So that's what's at stake in hegemony. You can talk about hegemony, you can talk about manufacturing consent, it's still a version of the same argument, and our assumption has always been that that's how power works, right? You have to be able to present your particular interest as the general interest, and that has to feel right to people, right? They have to really understand, they have to deeply believe that their interest is reflected in this hegemonic construction of a public good. And so what I began to think about as I was working on that book is that it's simply not clear to me that kind of hegemonic power building occurs anymore once the state is effectively privatized. Because that's what neoliberalism does. The state is bought and sold. You have a Republican Party, you have a Democratic Party. It's all the same thing. It's all beholden to corporate money. You suppress some voting rights along the way. You gerrymander some problematic districts, right? And you're done. And you have a democracy which is pure spectacle, right? In which the choice is always no choice. And so, in that kind of a context, the work of actually norming public sentiment, which is a lot of work, which takes a lot of work. It's a vast ideological project. There are institutions, including institutions of higher education, which have been historically dedicated to that, right? Why bother to do that, right? So, you could put it a slightly different way and say the modern nation state, the democratic nation state, is always split between dedication to private property and an ostensible dedication to a public good. And neoliberalism just dedicates the public good, right? So, what I've thought about in that book is that, in fact, in this new context, if the state no longer needs to produce consensus, if it no longer needs to norm public sentiment, right, we're actually emerging into a moment in which it serves the interest of the state for us to go into our separate ideological, political ways, right? The state, there is nothing about social decomposition that is any longer inimical to the reproduction of state power. So that's what I was trying to think about in this book. And at the moment I was writing it, I was in the thick of it, and I was kind of going around and giving talks. It was really impossible to think about this without being asked about Occupy Wall Street, right? That's what everybody said. Well, yeah, but what about Occupy Wall Street? And I thought that what was really interesting about Occupy Wall Street is that I would see it as a kind of secessionist movement, sort of very much in the way that Shane was talking about a few minutes ago, right? It's a form, what I thought was most interesting about it, there was, of course, big debates, is what is it doing, what kind of demands is it making, what kind of demands on power, who is it speaking to, on whose behalf, right, all these questions. And I thought what was really interesting about it was that it wasn't making demands. It was radically non-participatory. It was a form of alternate left world building, like let's build a socialist polity in the middle of the financial district, right? So I mean sort of secessionist in that sense. And one of the things, I guess what I would say is that even though Occupy Wall Street appears to be defunct, well, let me actually say one other thing about it as a movement, right? It was sometimes referred to as a movement, as a social movement, and that really did seem to me a misnomer, because a social movement presumes precisely a hegemonic project, right? It presumes a mode of assimilation, of assembling, of generating a discourse and a set of demands in which multiple constituencies can see their interests rightly or wrongly reflected. And what was so interesting about Occupy Wall Street is that because of its emphasis on radical participatory democracy, it couldn't do that. It was deliberately not a mass movement, so it could proliferate, right? You could have lots of different occupations in different venues, but you couldn't have, it was not a mass social movement in the way we think about it, in the 1960s, for instance. And so what seems to me kind of moving forward then a little bit is what seems to be interesting about Occupy Wall Street is that while it is, as far as one can tell, defunct or dormant, it has spawned a real renaissance in left world building of a broadly secessionist character in the U.S. So what I mean is that groups, there are a resurgence of groups that are organizing themselves around a refusal of the political givens, right? They're not interested in political participation. They're not running candidates for office. They're not organizing in the mode of a political party, right? Black Lives Matter would be a salient example of that. They are, and it's also, they're kind of operating on the idea of a radical break with the political script. Right, so they're not going to, they do formulate demands, but their demands are clearly eccentric to whatever we might think about as sort of comporting itself with any kind of realist politics, right? So I would think of it as secessionist in that way. And so I've been really interested in this resurgence of left world building. But the point I want to make tonight is that increasingly what I find most interesting are left secessionist projects that are actually contending for a piece of the state apparatus. And it goes exactly to some of the questions that have been discussed, right? What is the status? There's something very potent about this kind of world building, about refusing naturalized narratives of capitalism, of austerity. But then there's always the question of how they sit in the world and whether or not, or to what extent they do or they can or they might interrupt the reproduction of established power. And so I've been really interested in a particular version of left secession, which is actually about sort of breaking off a little piece of the state. So I'll just say that I started thinking about this around Trump pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords and various states and municipalities declaring that they were still in. That's a relatively banal kind of thing on one level, and on another level, that is a secessionist move. That is a state or other kind of political entity taking up a position. It's sort of going to the question you were just thinking about, right? Taking up a position that is only supposed to be negotiated at the level of nation-state power, right? But there's also lots of other examples: sanctuary cities, non-cooperation with ICE, so non-cooperation with toxic federal immigration policy and policing. I just heard the other day that, and then there's local politics, right? So I just heard the other day that there's a new sheriff of Durham, North Carolina, of all places. So kind of an odd town, home to Duke University, but also historically African American, with now a really large Latino population too. They have elected a sheriff, I believe African American, who came in on the platform of total non-cooperation with ICE. And that's the sheriff's office, right? So I've become really interested in local politics, right? Whether it's city councils, obviously in the case of Seattle, or sheriff's offices, or forms of sort of ways to direct left secession, which are about shaking loose some tiny fragment of the state apparatus. And therefore contending for the institutions where power is reproduced. So that's what I'll leave you with. maybe on a more hopeful note than all the fascist secessions.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. I'll just ask 2 questions and leave them to answer it. But before I do that, you might wonder how we pay for this. This year, starting today, we have a GoFundMe. And if you ask me, I couldn't even tell you how to get to it. But keep looking at our website. Give us your emails. It'll get to you. And give what you can. We can really use it. We want to keep doing this again. I have 2 questions. One is, secession, in a way, is a kind of revolution. It's a rupture. If we think of, everybody makes a pretty convincing case, I think, that secession in and of itself benefits the right. But have we taken this total rupture, this transition from laws that we can see are not working to something else by what would be called revolution? And again, I don't mean not necessarily everybody going to the Winter Palace, grabbing arms and doing it, but perhaps what Eva proposes could be one version of essentially pushing the state institutions that don't work anymore to complete the destruction that they deserve and that they've been doing. I mean, someone said the other day at Red May that what we've had is a 40-year, it's like the New Deal. It's as big a state-building construction as the New Deal, but all it's given us is prisons and wars. So that's what we've accomplished in 40 years. That state can't be allowed to exist anymore. I have no particular notion of how to bring it over, to an end, but I do want to recommend a new book called Hinterland by Phil Neal, who's a geographer. It's his PhD dissertation. Do you know this?
I think maybe.
It just came out, and everybody at Third Place Book, you must carry this book in there. He comes up with a theory of the economic geography of space at the moment. And what he says is the picture that we get is of a city that's kind of sucking dry the rural areas and, is living high off the hog, and there's nothing intermediary to the city. He said the biggest part of capitalism is in the hinterland. It's Amazon warehouses, it's slaughterhouses, it's servers for internet companies, and the working class there is multicolored, low-paid, homeless, living off food stamps, and so forth. This is increasing everywhere. So, in line with Eva's notion that this state is ceasing to provide for, is leaving you on your own for this. What he says is he compares some of the white identity movements in Oregon, which you guys can speak about, like the Oath Keepers and so forth, and he says he's noticed that a lot of people have totally given up on getting anything to address whatever problem they may have. So they're all making up a lot of community networks. It's part of the way that white identity racists pull in a lot of people who have genuine economic distress. They have giving disaster response courses, community preparedness, protecting local businesses, doing a lot, and as Phil says, they're armed. So he sees this particular notion of, now again, so I want to see how you would fit that in your model of the world, particularly this new geographical reconfiguration, if you agree with Phil or not, as to whether his picture of how capitalism accumulates is reasonable, and how that would I guess I would for that one.
I'll start.
And what it means for thinking about fascism is what I want.
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. So there's a pretty long tradition of geopolitics, thinking about things in terms of the sea power or land power, right? And like typically the North Atlantic sort of English empire and whatnot is associated with sea power, which comes from actually, interestingly enough, a U.S. Naval Academy researcher. Can't remember his name off the top of my head. And then there's the other side, which is the land power, which comes from Mackinder, Halford Mackinder, who's an English geopolitics guy, talking especially about the world island, which is like this ginormous concept of from the southern cone of Africa, from the Cape down to over to Vladivostok, right? So the whole Asia, Europe, and Africa. And the heartland of this area is basically the steppes that connects Africa to Asia to Europe, which is interesting because this was developed into part of the Aryan myth that Germany wanted to expand into the Lebensraum of the steppes, where the heartland, which is relatively unpopulated, is, so that they can, express their, colonial power and whatnot. So when I hear things like, geopolitics or something like heartland and hinterland, which is often Mackinderized geographies, I'm somewhat reticent to jump on board just because of the generalism that's involved in regional thought. It's kind of weird. I have a love-hate relationship with it because I teach the Pacific Northwest in the geography department of Portland State University. So regionalism is something that I always think it's really important to deconstruct and to approach from a number of different angles, which I'm sure that this author definitely does. I haven't read the book, unfortunately. And it is clear that, like, the Midwest, for example, like, what is the Midwest going to secede from, and, like, how, and, what is it going to be? Like, they call it the Rust Belt or something. I did a tour of the Midwest, like Indy and Milwaukee and all these different, over to Cleveland, and it was just like, everybody's really super great, but I'm not seeing the Midwest sponsoring some big secessionist plan, right? It's just like, here we are, let's change things, which is kind of the way that I approach things, right? I'm from Houston, Texas, part of that kind of gigantic, weird, in the middle of these regions, and I don't think of things in terms of like, it's time to secede and to start our new grand plan with our own worldview and, to create things while, I think like part of like a materialist strategy or a materialist way of thinking is to approach things as they are and to try to, do the work, to carry out the kind of duties, ethical and principled, that will bring about changes that you want to see. And I don't necessarily think that drawing new borders is going to help us bring that about whatsoever. Now, conceptually, when you're talking about like seceding from this, that, and the other, I get a little bit lost. It seems like blank slate, stuff. And when I think of the Pacific Northwest and blank slate, I think white utopia. I think settler colonialism. And then I think of the weird kind of like anarchist or Bellamyite colonies that were created out here, like the Home Colony, if anybody's familiar with that, in the Puget Sound. And those things were really cool. They were really awesome. Let's move out into the middle of nowhere and create our own thing until something burns down and everybody gets into fights and then we run away. And that's what like my experience oftentimes of radical groups kind of is. Which like it's cool in a way, like people moving around and disassociating and reassociating and having affinities, never really, fetishizing single place or wanting that kind of connection because we have each other. But at the same time, these are all really complex issues that we have to build on while we're working toward better things. And in my opinion, relating to each other and the kind of uniqueness and specificness of our own, where we're coming from, is far more important than rooting ourselves in our identities to the exclusion of others in a given place, So on the other hand, last point, if you want to say like a revolution is a secession or something like that, or a regime change or something, we can use different words for these things, but revolution or insurrection or transformation or transition, and these different kinds of words that all carry different connotations. And I don't think we should look at revolution as a universal positive. Part of fascism calls for a national revolution. Fascism is absolutely, a revolutionary ultra-nationalist strategy to destroy liberal democracy and reinstitute something that came before then with futurist trappings. Highly reactionary and ultra-hierarchical, although sometimes slipped under there as like natural hierarchies, hee-hee, organic states, hee-hee. So I think, there aren't any easy answers to this. It's easier to point out problems than it is to find solutions, because the solutions come about through our work, and we're not going to be giving them out through podiums and, wise people. So, yeah, sit down. Thanks.
Anybody else want to take those, or should we go to the audience? Okay, so some audience questions? Yeah?
Hold back to the audience.
I'm definitely not as steeped in knowledge as any of you by a million miles. So I don't know if this is a big question or not. But I'm wondering how...
Hold on. Why don't we keep the mic?
Yeah.
Is that all right? Because I just can't... Oh, I guess not. So I'm just wondering how, since the election of Trump and the springing up of, in this country, the resistance in the form of so many different small left-leaning organizations and state action and even possibly regional action against the federal government fits into this conversation.
I just wanted to say one thing which I had thought of in relation to Eva's comments, which is that I think that there is something really valuable about these small community building spaces. And that's because radical practice does not spring like Athena from Zeus's head, fully formed. It's we always have this difficulty that we know what we're against and we have a revolution. We don't know what we're for necessarily, and then after you get your independence, you end up with the Nehruvian state, and you end up with the Indian government suppressing the Naxalites, and you end up with the complete erasure of the rights of Kashmiris, and that's because it was just taken for granted. All we needed to do was to get rid of the British, and we never spent a lot of time practicing what we would be after, which was the post-colonial dilemma. And I think that that's very valuable. That said, I do want to caution that when we do these practices, we might practice locally, but we must, I don't want to say think globally because that's the wrong word, we must be aware of the global context. I'm very particularly interested and fascinated by the incredible support given to Tulsi Gabbard as a key sort of representative supporter for Bernie Sanders, with a tremendous amount of support in certain leftish edges, Bernie Sanders edges of the Democratic Party. And she is, to my mind, the same bizarrity as proposing Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh as a radical anything. She's, and I don't mean this lightly, she is a Hindu fundamentalist. She is a supporter, I'm not saying these just as random descriptors, she is a member of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, a supporter of that. So this is an actual institutional affiliation with an official Islamophobic nation-state project. And it's very difficult if you only say all that matters is that we pay attention to the fact that you're against Trump, that you're, you have to pay attention to what they're for beyond that.
Go ahead. Are you sure?
Yeah, go.
I guess with the theme of secession, we can't secede from Trump. He is here whether we like it or not. And I think it's also worthwhile to think a little bit about what it means to have a counterpower movement that's separate from state institutions or institutions of power, and having that be a secessionist movement that refuses to then challenge back. Because we're given no choice right now. We walk away from Trump, we walk away and create kind of some kind of separateness. He's still there, the conditions are still there. Neoliberalism is still creeping. I still can't pay my rent. And so the reality is that at some point, even when we back away, even when we refuse state power, we still have to kind of clash back. And in a way, I think it's worthwhile to talk maybe even the traditional sense of what revolution means, to undermine the power structures entirely and to say that we actually can't just rely on obliterating key parts of them, but we have to look at the system as a whole and what's it going to take to get there. And frankly, I think, at least from my head, that means all of us together.
I'm going to get at that a slightly different way, right? Which is that I think the problem is, so you said we can't secede from Trump, but the flip side of that, to my mind, is that that's exactly what we're encouraged to do. I mean, what I've been trying to think about is secession is the rule of the day, right? That's how state power now operates, right? Scatter us to, whatever political enthusiasms we wish to pursue, right? I actually think that has something to do with how Trump comes into power in the first place. So the problem is, and that's always found it so interesting when you were talking, Alexander, that, the Russians are trying to manipulate, to take down some kind of liberal democratic center. What liberal democratic? I mean, I don't understand the. I come from a department where people are very concerned about the problem of liberalism, and I just don't get it. I just don't want to say where do you live? Because where I live, that's just really not the problem. So I think, to my mind, your question is about the way in which what can that secession do, when in fact kind of cutting us loose to our own political enthusiasms is exactly the way in which power now operates. And that's why I was trying to think about the sort of question of where you secede and how you secede and what you're breaking a piece off of when you do that work really makes a difference.
I think I may have led this discussion in the wrong direction. By framing it, I didn't mean to suggest that secession is a viable left strategy that could be explored, or that we should see what would happen in secession. I was trying to frame it along Eva's notion and our own experience, that things get worse and worse in terms of what the state provides. That inequality goes up, employment becomes more precarious, the state takes less and less responsibility. That's just the way it's headed. Now, it can be turned around politically or so forth, but it might require some sort of rupture to do that. And so it's framing a response to the state's withdrawal that I was more interested in everybody thinking about. And I think what Phil Neal does in his book, I mean, maybe it is left McKinder, but again, I think one has to try to get a sense of the political economy of the world, how capitalism creates value at the moment, where it accumulates, what it can't stop doing. It's no longer the same point of production process in big factories, large working classes as it was in the 19th century. It's something that we've never seen, where people are bringing food logistically from, which could be grown 20 miles away, they're bringing it from the other side of the earth because it's cheaper to do so by labor arbitrage. So the question of how to take that state that has grown up like a hideous, bizarro world of the New Deal and sort of get rid of that and make it a human state again is a real one, I think. Any other questions?
Just to jump on that really quick, I think that distinction should be made between the receding of government and the receding of the state. So as we have a receding of government services, of governance as this kind of maybe even utopian idea of people together making decisions, we have an increase of state apparatus, of police repression, and as capitalism marches through here and creates a large underclass of people, the state expands in a way to suppress those people and to kind of stop revolutionary movements. And so I always like to think of this like, is it the state or is it the concessions the state has made? Because in periods of austerity, they take everything back that we've ever gotten from them.
That's it. You want to?
So I'll hold the mic. There's two questions.
What?
I think there was one also first in here. Please keep the questions short so that we can.
Let's take all the questions and I think we're going to.
I think you actually covered it, but I'll have to mention a name. We're talking about secession, local secession. regional secession. I was interested in just what your response is to the idea of Cascadia, the left of center version of Cascadia. I was interested in your responses to it.
I want to get the next person's.
Mine's a pretty different question than that, so but I guess I'll ask it and we can pick and choose. I was curious about the opposite of Cascadia and very local. I was curious about some of the global means, some of the global sites of secession, and particularly, actually I think Shane sort of maybe answered my question before I got around to asking it, which is maybe this is a place for distinction between sort of global governance and global state or global means of enforcement of coercion. But I think two of the definitive things that have really brought together this sort of secessionist alliance of hard left and far right has been the war in Syria and the sort of gleeful exit from the pretense of that kind of aspirational pretense of a global humanitarian order and bottom line. And I want to clarify, it's not that abuses and transgressions of humanitarian global order haven't happened since the establishment of the UN or whatever, but a lot of the time it's sort of happened in secret, and I don't know, the war in Indonesia, the Central American history through the 70s and 80s, it had to kind of happen against a narrative, right? It had to happen in some means under denial, under some means of secrecy, and by the time it came to public acknowledgement, it had to sort of be wrapped up, as opposed to Syria, which is the most documented conflict that's ever happened in human history. And we have an alliance between Duginists and the far right who are kind of gleefully getting together with, Max Blumenthal and a lot of figures on the left, for example, just kind of cheering on the death of this global humanitarian pretense. And then, interestingly, I think in a way that comes back to the BJP, also another perceived, I don't know if it's true, but a sort of perceived global order that people are gleefully tearing apart, and there's a complete consensus on the sort of hard left and the far right is about the sort of perceived Sunni Islam global cooperation that people are quick to get paranoid about with some of the same kind of traditional discourses. And I think in a way, again, we have really open, naked Islamophobia popping up in the left, and then the right, and they're very much happy to share platforms with that. So I wonder about does that seem fair that that's been those have been key sites in bringing together this kind of new coalition through secessionism.
And does this parallel in some way make sense with the governance versus coalition distinction?
Yeah, I know Charu mentioned the BJP and kind of their structure with the cultural, military, and political wing, and I was thinking damn, I'm jealous of having that kind of institutional power, and thinking about what is the left equivalent of that kind of situation? I mean, are we looking at decades of anti-communism that have completely eroded our ability to structure our society in that way? And thinking about Alex Reid Ross mentioning dual power and survival pending revolution, and what does that look like today? And I'm thinking about my personal experiences in Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Seattle rather, and just thinking we weren't even able to we held our own against a handful of Nazis, fascists showing up on Halloween, but then a few months later, we can't hold our own against the sanitation department, the police, winter. So in Ukraine, you're freaking building ice palaces, and the Bundys managed to hold 2 successful occupations. So I'm trying to think what is the anemia of the left, and where is that coming from?
Okay, sweet. The answers? Let's put
There was one more.
One more, okay.
Back, yeah.
So during the WTO, there was a definition of fascism that we all heard over and over again. And Mussolini basically said, or not Mussolini, but George Orwell said in the 50s that Americans don't know what fascism is, right? And I think a lot of times political words get co-opted, and also definitions of words get changed over time also. But Mussolini invented the word fascism, and he said it was the merger of state and corporate power. And then, if you accept that definition, then neoliberalism is fascism, right? So, but I haven't heard that today. People are talking about the manifestations of fascism, because there's all kinds of totalitarianism, there's all kinds of racism, there's all kinds of authoritarianism. Those aren't necessarily fascism, but fascism needs those in order to rule. And if you were to ask people who call themselves fascists these days, if you told them it was corporatism, they wouldn't be for it. None of the Tea Party or any of these people would say that, because that's what they were rebelling against. They were rebelling against the big banks and all that stuff. So they don't have a clue, actually, of what they're talking about. So we need to be clear about it, I think.
Okay, thanks. The bookstore is closing in 10 minutes, so maybe we can explain
Can we just start at that corner?
We started that corner, yeah.
All right. I'll just try to say a few things. Firstly, it's interesting about Cascadia because, technically speaking, Cascadia is not supposed to be a separatist or a secessionist movement. It's supposed to be a bioregional movement that's based on the ecology of the bioregion, right? So it's not actually really a political thing, or it shouldn't be. It wasn't originally, and the people who are trying to co-opt it for as right-wing political secessionism are actually way off the mark in relation to the actual sort of idea. If you want to call it a kind of left-wing idea, I think that makes sense. There's a lot of problematic aspects of it. Then a tendency to join left and right in any kind of movement that keeps its politics a little bit under the vest, but or against its vest. But anyway, just going around the room, Shane can probably speak to this a little better. But the quote that you have is often used, but it's actually not an authentic Mussolini quote. The idea of corporatism that was deployed by fascists was tied to Catholic action in the 19th century and the Spanish dictatorship. It had more to do with bringing syndicalists into the national solidarity, into the idea of the nation, and bringing the leadership of unions under the power of the authoritarian bureaucracy of the state. And then, acting as though there was some kind of worker power under a fascist state. So the idea of corporatism that we think of, when we think corporatism, we think maybe multinational corporations and things like that, but actually that's not what they meant when they said corporatism, and they didn't really use corporatism as a defining factor of fascism. In fact, fascism was always more of a rebirth of a mythical nation, ultra-nationalist sentiment of patriarchy that was supposed to be reborn into this new age, right, as a new man for the times. And so they basically imported all of the old imperialist ideology into a pseudo-revolutionary, reactionary, sort of spiritualized cult that became extremely popular because it was good at putting down left-wing movements. Well, it didn't become extremely popular. It became extremely popular among very rich people who had resources. And I think that the question that you asked over there, sir, about sovereignty, I didn't say that stuff, by the way. That was Shane, so blame him. I think it boils down to the question of sovereignty and to what extent we want to consider it or use it. I think that a lot of people on the left went toward the right in the early 90s, especially contemplating the ideas of Nazis like Carl Schmitt and how they might
manifest in a kind of populist left-right movement that could be able to violently take power. And the idea there always seemed to gravitate towards a "we'll figure it out later" kind of attitude, you know. And I think instead of using the far right as a template for our power, I think we need to actually build our power through solidarity. And regarding your question, Sean, thank you very much for asking and for coming. Sean McFessel is a great journalist and an author of a good book that you might find around here about nonviolence and its uselessness in a lot of regards. It's not nonviolence ain't what it used to be, is it? It is, yeah. I'm not good at remembering titles, but hey, you can tell it's a very good book. So regarding that, like thinking secessionism and the Middle East, and especially the Syria conflict, the vast war against humanity carried out by the Assad regime. The clearest example of secessionism there would be the Rojava autonomous zone, basically, which a lot of people have compared to the EZLN Zapatista, realidad, but is interesting in the way that it has developed, because it developed through concessions with the Assad, because they wanted to fight ISIS, which is really understandable. Nobody really paid attention to it until the Battle of Kobani. And then from then on, it was seen as this huge triumphant movement. But obviously, there are a lot of issues with that movement as well. I shouldn't put all kind of left-wing movements in this kind of pure sacralized idol. But thinking more in terms of the revolution in Syria and secessionism, in terms of revolution, I think that's a more complicated question, but as regards to the geopolitical merger of the left and the right over that, and it leads to the complete breakdown in the assumptions that sort of undergird left-wing politics in general, equality, freedom, and instead of that, we'll just do national sovereignty. Why not?
And
right?
there's an enthusiasm about that from both left and right.
Okay, so sorry to interrupt, but our bookstore does close in about 5 minutes.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much for coming and.